The diner was empty except for the heavy-set men occupying the back corner booth. Victor's gold fountain pen hovered just millimeters above the thick, multi-million-dollar contract, the wet ink ready to finally seal his long-awaited transition into legitimate commercial real estate. "I wouldn't sign that," a quiet, distinctly unwavering voice interrupted from the shadows. Victor froze. He slowly looked up, his cold, calculating eyes locking onto the young waitress standing right beside the table, a steaming coffee pot held in her hand. "Excuse me?" Victor's voice was dangerously low, a gravelly whisper. "Page 12, subsection 4, Brielle said, her gaze meeting his without flinching. "That clause is a trap. It silently strips your primary holding company of all assets if a federal inquiry is ever launched." The air in the diner instantly vanished. In a fraction of a second, Victor's hand slipped beneath his tailored suit jacket, and he drew his gun, aiming the dark, heavy barrel dead at her chest. The rain had been falling in relentless, heavy sheets against the diner's large plate glass windows for over 3 hours, blurring the neon lights of the city into long, bleeding streaks of crimson and electric blue. Inside the Midnight Owl diner, the atmosphere was suffocatingly thick, smelling heavily of scorched diner coffee, industrial floor bleach, and the unmistakable, metallic scent of nervous perspiration. Brielle stood behind the scuffed Formica counter, her hands rhythmically polishing a ceramic coffee mug with a faded white towel. She moved with the practiced, invisible grace of someone who had spent years learning exactly how to blend perfectly into the background. A ghost haunting the graveyard shift, she wore a standard, unglamorous uniform, a pale yellow dress with a white apron that tied securely around her waist. But her eyes, sharp and endlessly observant, betrayed an intellect that did not belong in a rundown, roadside eatery. Across the checkered linoleum floor, occupying the largest and most secluded leather-upholstered booth in the very back of the establishment, sat Victor. He was a man whose mere presence seemed to completely absorb the light and oxygen from the surrounding space. He wore a meticulously tailored, charcoal gray suit that whispered of obscene wealth, his dark hair combed back perfectly despite the severe weather outside. Flanking him were 2 massive, stone-faced men who moved as little as possible, their eyes constantly scanning the empty diner with predatory vigilance. Sitting directly opposite Victor was a man who was sweating profusely, dabbing repeatedly at his shiny forehead with a crumpled silk handkerchief. This man had brought the briefcase. He had brought the thick stack of legal documents that currently rested on the sticky table between the salt shaker and the napkin dispenser. For the past 45 minutes, Brielle had been silently moving through the diner, refilling water glasses, wiping down perfectly clean tables, and listening. She possessed a rare, almost photographic memory and a deeply ingrained, almost pathological need to understand the subtext of every conversation happening within her earshot. As she had poured coffee for the sweating man 15 minutes prior, her eyes had naturally, almost involuntarily, scanned the upside-down text on the crisp white pages of the contract. It was a massive merger agreement, a document designed to legally launder an empire's worth of illicit capital through a massive downtown real estate development project. It was Victor's golden ticket out of the underworld. But as her eyes had darted across the dense, deliberately convoluted legalese on page 12, her breath had hitched. She had recognized the structural phrasing immediately. It was a poison pill. Now, as the clock on the wall ticked agonizingly toward 2 a.m, the tension in the booth reached its absolute zenith. The sweating man was leaning forward, his voice a tight, high-pitched whine as he urged Victor to finalize the paperwork. Victor was silent, projecting an aura of absolute dominance, yet Brielle could see the faint, almost imperceptible lines of exhaustion around his eyes. He wanted this deal. He needed this deal to be real. He reached slowly into his inner breast pocket, his movements deliberate and heavy with the weight of consequence, and withdrew a heavy gold fountain pen. He unscrewed the cap. The soft, metallic scrape seemed to echo like a gunshot in the quiet diner. Brielle stood frozen behind the counter. The internal war raging inside her mind was deafening. If she spoke, she would absolutely destroy the carefully constructed, invisible life she had spent the last 3 years building. She would expose herself to the most dangerous men in the city. She would step directly into the crosshairs of a ruthless Mafia boss. But if she remained silent, she would be complicit in a legally orchestrated execution. She knew exactly what the men who had drafted that contract were capable of. They were the very same invisible, corporate monsters who had completely destroyed her own life. The realization that Victor, a man feared by the entire criminal underworld, was about to be effortlessly slaughtered by men in expensive suits wielding fountain pens, ignited a fierce, uncontrollable spark of defiance deep within her chest. She placed the ceramic mug down on the counter. The sharp clack of the porcelain against the wood was loud, but not loud enough to draw their attention. She picked up a fresh pot of steaming dark roast coffee from the burner. Her hands were remarkably steady, belying the absolute terror that was beginning to flood her veins. She stepped out from behind the safety of the counter and began the long, agonizing walk across the checkered floor toward the back booth. With every single step she took, the sound of the driving rain outside seemed to fade away, replaced entirely by the thunderous, frantic beating of her own heart. She approached the table just as Victor lowered the nib of his pen toward the signature line. She saw the sweating man's eyes widen in a brief, uncontrolled flash of victorious greed. It was now or never. She didn't hesitate. She stepped directly into the dimly lit space of the booth, the coffee pot held securely in her grip, and spoke the words that would irrevocably alter the course of both their lives, shattering the heavy silence and setting into motion a chain of events that neither of them could possibly anticipate. The heavy, metallic click of the gun's hammer being pulled back sounded louder than a thunderclap in the confined space of the diner. The weapon, a matte black semi-automatic pistol, was leveled perfectly at the center of Brielle's chest. The two stone-faced bodyguards had also reacted instantly. Though they hadn't drawn their weapons, their bodies were coiled, their hands hovering dangerously close to their waistbands. The man sitting across from Victor, the one who had presented the contract, let out a sharp, undignified gasp, shrinking violently back into the red vinyl of the booth, his eyes darting frantically between Victor's gun and Brielle's apron. Brielle did not scream. She did not drop the coffee pot. The scalding heat radiating from the glass against her knuckles was the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. She forced herself to look away from the hollow, black eye of the barrel and directly into Victor's eyes. They were completely devoid of warmth, calculating the exact level of threat she posed. In his world, sudden interruptions during multi-million-dollar transactions were usually followed by gunfire. "You have exactly 3 seconds to give me a reason why I shouldn't pull this trigger," Victor said. His voice did not echo. It absorbed into the room, heavy and final. 1. "I told you," Brielle said, her voice dropping an octave, desperately fighting to keep the tremor out of her words. She refused to break eye contact. Page 12, subsection 4, paragraph B. The indemnity waiver. 2. Victor whispered, his finger tightening imperceptibly on the trigger. "It's not a standard indemnity clause," Brielle rushed out, her words tumbling over each other but remaining agonizingly precise. "It's cleverly disguised as standard limitation of liability. But the phrasing dictates that in the event of any state or federal investigation into the primary holding company, your company all equity, all assets, and all voting rights immediately default to the secondary guarantor, which is his shell corporation." She violently jerked her chin toward the sweating man across the table. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating. Victor did not move his gun. He did not blink. He slowly, deliberately shifted his gaze from Brielle's pale, determined face to the man sitting across from him. The man's face had drained of all color, transforming into a sickly, chalky white. The sweat on his forehead was no longer born of nervous anticipation, but of sheer, unadulterated terror. "Victor, listen to me. This girl is crazy. She's a diner waitress, for God's sake. She doesn't know what she's talking about." The man's voice cracked, high and reedy, a desperate, scrambling sound that completely betrayed his guilt. He reached trembling hands toward the contract, attempting to pull it back across the table. "Leave the paperwork right where it is," Victor commanded softly. The man froze, his hands hovering over the table. Victor slowly lowered the gun, though he did not put it away. He rested his forearm on the table, the weapon still loosely but securely gripped in his hand, the barrel now angled casually toward the sweating man's stomach. With his left hand, Victor reached out and pulled the thick stack of papers toward him. He flipped past the first 11 pages with agonizing slowness. The sound of the thick, high-quality paper rustling was the only noise in the room. He found page 12. He found subsection 4. He read it in silence. Brielle stood perfectly still, the muscles in her legs screaming from the locked tension. She watched Victor's eyes scan the dense, blocky paragraphs of text. She knew exactly how confusing the wording was. It was designed by a team of Ivy League lawyers to be completely impenetrable to anyone without specialized training in corporate sabotage. It used circular references and buried definitions to hide its true venomous intent. Victor read the paragraph twice. Then, he looked up at the sweating man. The change in Victor's demeanor was subtle but absolutely terrifying. The cold calculation in his eyes had been replaced by a deep, dark, and hollow abyss of promised violence. "You told me," Victor said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, conversational whisper, "that your people had drafted a clean transition, a completely legitimate partnership to wash the portfolio. You told me this was my exit." It is, Victor, I swear to God. The clause is standard boilerplate. It's just to protect the board from. "Shut up," Victor said. He didn't raise his voice, but the command struck the man like a physical blow. Victor slowly turned his head to look back at Brielle. He looked at her stained apron, her sensible rubber-soled shoes, her hair pulled back into a messy, practical bun. And then he looked at her eyes again. He recognized the sharp, analytical intelligence there. It was entirely out of place in this greasy, roadside diner at 2 a.m. "How do you know what that clause means?" Victor asked her. The gun was no longer pointed at her, but the danger radiating from him had not diminished in the slightest. "Because," Brielle said, taking a slow, shallow breath, desperately trying to keep her knees from buckling under the overwhelming adrenaline crash. "I used to be the person who wrote them." Victor stared at her for a long, heavy moment. He slowly engaged the safety on his pistol with a loud click and slid the weapon smoothly back into the shoulder holster concealed beneath his tailored jacket. He stood up from the booth. He was taller than Brielle had realized, towering over her with a physical presence that was utterly overwhelming. He looked down at the sweating man, who was now visibly shaking, clutching the edge of the table, as if trying to keep from falling off the edge of the world. "Get out of my sight," Victor said to the man. "If I ever see you, or anyone connected to your firm, within the city limits again, I won't bother reading the paperwork." The man scrambled out of the booth so fast he nearly tore the vinyl. He didn't bother grabbing his expensive briefcase. He practically ran for the diner's glass doors, bursting out into the driving rain without looking back. Victor's 2 massive bodyguards immediately stepped forward, ready to pursue. "Let him go," Victor commanded, raising a single authoritative hand. "He's just a messenger." Victor turned slowly back to Brielle. The diner was now entirely empty, save for the 4 of them. The neon lights buzzed quietly overhead. The rain hammered relentlessly against the glass. "Lock the front doors," Victor said to his men, his eyes never leaving Brielle's face. "Flip the open sign and pull the blinds." He gestured to the empty booth opposite his own. "Sit down. You and I are going to have a very long conversation, and you are going to tell me exactly who you are." The heavy, metallic thud of the deadbolt sliding into place echoed through the empty diner, sealing them off from the rain-soaked world outside. The 2 massive men moved with terrifying efficiency, pulling down the faded, grease-stained plastic blinds, completely obscuring the neon glow of the streetlights. The diner, previously a haven for weary late-night travelers, was instantly transformed into a sterile, claustrophobic interrogation room. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigeration units and the relentless drumming of the storm against the roof. Brielle sat rigidly in the booth Victor had indicated. The worn red vinyl squeaked slightly beneath her. She kept her hands firmly planted on her thighs, pressing them down hard to stop the visible trembling that threatened to overtake her. The adrenaline that had propelled her to interrupt the meeting was rapidly evaporating, leaving behind a cold, hollow dread. She had exposed herself. The meticulously crafted, agonizingly lonely life she had built here, pouring coffee and surviving on cash tips, was completely destroyed. Victor slid into the booth opposite her. Up close, the aura of danger surrounding him was almost palpable. He didn't look like a common street thug. He looked like a highly successful CEO, dressed in dark wool and silk, but there was a deep, underlying brutality in the set of his jaw and the stillness of his posture. He placed the thick, leather-bound contract on the table between them and rested his large hands on top of it. "Coffee," Victor said softly, glancing at the pot she had left on the counter. "Pour me a cup, and one for yourself." Brielle hesitated for only a fraction of a second before standing up. Her legs felt like lead, but she forced herself to walk steadily to the counter, retrieve 2 clean mugs, and pour the dark, bitter liquid. She brought them back to the table, placing one carefully in front of him. She sat back down, wrapping her cold hands around her own mug, drawing whatever warmth she could from the cheap ceramic. "Drink," he commanded gently. She took a small sip. The coffee tasted like ash in her mouth. Victor didn't touch his mug. He just watched her. He was dissecting her visually, peeling back the layers of her disguise. "You pour coffee for minimum wage. You smell like fry grease and cheap vanilla soap. Yet you can instantly dismantle a highly complex, aggressively convoluted corporate merger document from a distance of 5 feet, upside down." He leaned forward slightly. "So, let's start with the basics. What is your name?" "Brielle," she said. Her voice was steady, surprising even herself. "Just Brielle? No last name?" "Just Brielle." Victor smiled, a slow, humorless expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Okay, Brielle. How did a diner waitress learn to spot a hostile corporate takeover trap buried in 30 pages of legalese?" Brielle stared down at the dark surface of her coffee. She knew she couldn't lie to him. A man like Victor had a sixth sense for deception, and lying would get her killed much faster than the truth. But telling the truth meant opening a door she had locked away in the darkest, most agonizing corner of her mind. "I didn't learn it here," Brielle said quietly. "I learned it in a high-rise office downtown. I used to be an associate at Vanguard and Pierce." For the first time all evening, genuine surprise flickered across Victor's stoic face. Vanguard and Pierce was not just a law firm. It was the most ruthless, powerful corporate legal entity in the state. They represented billionaires, corrupt politicians, and multinational conglomerates. They were the apex predators of the financial world. "Vanguard," Victor repeated, the name tasting sour in his mouth. "They don't hire waitresses, they hire prodigies." "I was a prodigy," Brielle stated, completely devoid of ego, stating a simple, tragic fact. "I graduated top of my class. I passed the bar with the highest score in the state. They recruited me right out of law school. I was placed on the acquisitions team. My job was to draft exactly the kind of document that was sitting on this table tonight. We built traps. We built legal labyrinths designed to steal companies, ruin lives, and shield our clients from any and all criminal liability. We were very, very good at it." Victor leaned back, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. The hostility in his posture had slightly abated, replaced by a dark, intense curiosity. "If you were a prodigy at the most powerful firm in the city, making mid-six figures, why are you hiding in a roadside diner at 2 a.m. wearing a stained apron?" Brielle closed her eyes. The memory hit her with the physical force of a tidal wave. The panic, the blood, the absolute destruction of everything she had ever known. "Because," she whispered, opening her eyes to meet his intense gaze, "I realized that the firm wasn't just facilitating white-collar crime. They were laundering money for the largest international cartel operating on the eastern seaboard. I found the ledger. I found the proof." Victor's eyes narrowed. "And you tried to blow the whistle." "I tried to go to the federal prosecutor," Brielle said, her voice shaking now, the suppressed trauma bubbling violently to the surface. "But the firm owned the prosecutor. Within 12 hours of my meeting with him, my apartment was burned to the ground. My bank accounts were completely drained and frozen. They framed me for massive corporate embezzlement, ensuring I would be arrested the moment I stepped out of the shadows. And then, they sent men to kill me. I barely escaped with the clothes on my back." She looked down at her hands, which were now trembling uncontrollably against the ceramic mug. "I've been running for 3 years. I changed my hair, my name, my entire existence. I work strictly for cash. I don't exist on paper. I hide here, serving coffee to truckers and drunks, hoping they forget I ever existed." Silence descended heavily upon the booth again. Victor looked at the woman sitting across from him. He had spent his entire life in the violent, unforgiving criminal underworld. He knew fear when he saw it, but he also knew incredible, hardened resilience. This woman had lost absolutely everything, had been hunted by apex predators, and yet she had just risked her life, stepping in front of a loaded gun to stop him from falling into the exact same trap that had ruined her. "Why did you stop me tonight?" Victor asked, his voice softer, devoid of its previous lethal edge. "You could have stayed quiet. You could have let me sign it. It would have been my ruin, not yours. Why risk your cover for a man like me?" Brielle looked at him, her eyes burning with a fierce, suppressed fire. "Because I know who drafted that contract, Victor. I recognize the phrasing. It's Vanguard's signature work. The men who want to take everything from you. The men who set that trap. They are the exact same men who took my life away. She took a deep, steadying breath. And I am tired of watching them win. Victor stared at her, the cogs in his brilliant, strategic mind turning rapidly. He looked down at the lethal contract, then back at the brilliant, broken, dangerous woman sitting across from him. "Pack your things," Victor said suddenly, his voice ringing with absolute authority. Brielle blinked, startled. "What? You can't stay here anymore. You exposed yourself. Even if that idiot doesn't remember your face, the people he works for will eventually trace the leak. You are compromised." Victor stood up, grabbing the contract and sliding it into his jacket. "You wanted to stop watching them win, Brielle? So do I. I need an architect to dismantle their maze, and you need a fortress to keep you alive." He looked down at her, extending a large, calloused hand. "You don't work at this diner anymore. You work for me." The transition from a life of greasy aprons and perpetual terror to the opulent, heavily guarded inner sanctum of Victor's operation was violently jarring. Brielle was whisked away from the Midnight Owl diner in the back of a bulletproof SUV, leaving behind her meager belongings in the small, damp room she had rented above a laundromat. She was brought to a sprawling, high-security penthouse suite that occupied the entire top floor of a downtown skyscraper. A building, she quickly realized, that Victor actually owned completely off the books. For the first 3 days, Brielle remained in a state of hypervigilant shock. The sheer scale of Victor's resources was staggering. She was given a massive master bedroom suite, an entirely new wardrobe of impeccably tailored professional clothing that fit her perfectly, and a dedicated, heavily encrypted laptop. But despite the luxury, she knew she was essentially a high-value prisoner, an asset to be utilized. She was guarded round the clock by silent, massive men who treated her with a cold, terrifying respect. On the evening of the 4th day, Victor finally summoned her to his private office. It was a cavernous room, lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a massive mahogany desk, and panoramic windows that offered a sweeping, God's-eye view of the city's glittering skyline. Victor was standing by the glass, holding a tumbler of amber liquid, staring out into the night. "Have you settled in?" he asked, without turning around as she entered. "As much as one can under the circumstances," Brielle replied, maintaining her professional distance. She stood near the heavy oak doors, unwilling to venture further into his domain than strictly necessary. Victor turned slowly, walking toward his desk. He gestured for her to take one of the plush leather chairs opposite him. "Sit," she complied, her posture perfect, her expression carefully guarded. Victor sat down heavily, resting his forearms on the polished mahogany. The desk was completely clear, save for a massive, heavily fortified steel lockbox. "I told you I needed an architect," Victor began, his voice dropping into that low, serious register she remembered from the diner. "For the past decade, I have built an empire through unconventional means. I control the docks, the shipping routes, the major unions. But the world is changing. The old ways of doing business, the violence, the overt intimidation, it's unsustainable. I want out. I want to transition every single asset, every dollar, into perfectly legal, untouchable corporate holdings." He reached out and keyed a complex combination into the steel lockbox. It sprang open with a heavy click. He began pulling out thick, expanding files, stacking them high on the desk between them. "This," Victor said, gesturing to the mountainous pile of paperwork, "is my entire life. Every deed, every shell corporation, every offshore account, every union contract. It is a massive, incredibly vulnerable mess. I thought the deal at the diner was my clean exit. You proved me wrong." Brielle looked at the files. The sheer volume of legally sensitive, highly illegal information sitting openly in front of her was staggering. "Why are you showing me this? I could memorize enough information in 10 minutes to put you in federal prison for the rest of your life, because I know you won't," Victor said simply, his dark eyes locking onto hers with unwavering intensity. "Because the people who built the trap in that contract, Vanguard and Pierce, and the cartel backing them, they are trying to aggressively absorb my territory. They don't want to arrest me. They want to legally assassinate me, steal my infrastructure, and use it to double their own operations. If they succeed, they own this entire city, and they will never stop hunting you." He pushed the first stack of files toward her. "I need you to audit everything. I need you to find every vulnerability, every hidden liability, and every potential trap my previous lawyers missed. I need you to build a fortress out of paper that Vanguard cannot penetrate. And then, I need you to help me design a counteroffensive." Brielle stared at the files. This was the dark underbelly of the corporate world she had once dominated. It was messy. It was incredibly dangerous. But it was also a puzzle of unparalleled complexity. More importantly, it was a weapon. If she could restructure Victor's empire, she could use his immense resources to finally strike back at the monsters who had destroyed her life. She reached out, her fingers brushing the rough manila folder on top of the stack. She felt a strange, thrilling surge of energy course through her veins. The terrified, hiding waitress was dying. The brilliant, ruthless legal strategist was waking up from a 3-year coma. "If I do this," Brielle said, her voice dropping, matching his intensity, "I need absolute authority over the restructuring process. You cannot question my legal directives. If I tell you to dissolve a company, you dissolve it. If I tell you to sever a partnership, you sever it. We do this exactly my way, or I don't touch it." Victor studied her face, searching for any sign of hesitation or bluff. He found none. He saw only cold, hard resolve. He slowly extended his hand across the mahogany desk. "You have absolute authority, Brielle," Victor said. She reached out and took his hand. His grip was powerful, calloused, and surprisingly warm. It was a pact sealed not in blood, but in mutual necessity and a shared desire for absolute retribution. "Then let's begin," Brielle said, pulling the first file open. For the next several hours, the opulent office transformed into a war room. Brielle fell into a state of intense, hyper-focused flow that she hadn't experienced in years. She tore through the complex financial documents with terrifying speed, her mind instantly recognizing the patterns of shell companies, dummy directors, and vulnerable capital flow. Victor sat opposite her, answering her rapid-fire questions with blunt honesty, offering context to the cold numbers on the page. As the night wore on, the initial, guarded tension between them began to shift into a dynamic of deep, unspoken respect. Victor watched in silent awe as she effortlessly dismantled legal structures that he had paid millions of dollars to build. She was brilliant, ruthless, and terrifyingly efficient. And as Brielle worked, surrounded by the quiet hum of the city far below and the imposing presence of the Mafia boss across the desk, she realized, for the first time in 3 long, agonizing years, that she finally felt safe. The penthouse office became their entire world. For 3 grueling weeks, Brielle and Victor practically lived within the glass walls of the war room. The massive mahogany desk was entirely buried beneath avalanches of legal briefs, forensic accounting ledgers, and intricate flowcharts, detailing the sprawling, chaotic nervous system of Victor's empire. The air always smelled of strong black espresso, dry erase markers, and the ozone scent of overworked laser printers. Brielle had shed the last remnants of the terrified waitress. She was commanding, decisive, and relentless. She wore her hair pulled back sharply, her designer clothes serving as a suit of armor as she waged a silent, brutal war on paper. She worked 20-hour days, her eyes scanning documents until the text blurred into meaningless shapes, driven by an unquenchable thirst to fortify Victor's holdings before Vanguard could strike again. It was 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. The city below was a quiet ocean of glittering lights. Brielle was standing in front of a massive glass whiteboard, a black marker in her hand, aggressively drawing connections between 3 offshore accounts and a domestic holding company. She was exhausted, her shoulders aching with a deep, persistent tension. Victor was sitting on the leather sofa, reviewing a stack of dissolved contracts she had finalized earlier that evening. He looked up, watching her work. The harsh overhead lighting cast long shadows across his face, highlighting the deep lines of stress and fatigue around his eyes. He had aged in the past 3 weeks, dismantling his empire, legally neutralizing the violent men who had sworn loyalty to him, was taking a massive psychological toll. "The Cayman's accounts are utterly compromised," Brielle said, not turning away from the board, violently drawing a thick, black X over a cluster of circles. "Vanguard has a backdoor through the international banking regulations governing those specific trusts. If they trigger a financial audit, they can freeze $800 million before you even receive the notification." Victor ran a heavy hand over his face. "So, what is the play?" We can't just move that much capital overnight without triggering a massive federal red flag. We don't move it, Brielle said, finally turning to face him. Her eyes were bright with a manic, brilliant energy. We legally donate it. Victor stared at her, completely stunned. You want me to donate $800 million? Not to charity, Brielle explained, pacing rapidly across the room. We create an irrevocable, blind trust, dedicated to urban development and union pension fortification, the very unions you currently control through intimidation. We transfer the capital into the trust. The beauty of an irrevocable blind trust is that legally, you no longer own the money. Vanguard cannot seize what you do not own. If I don't own it, I can't use it. Victor countered, his voice rumbling with skepticism. You won't need to, Brielle said softly, stopping her pacing and looking directly at him. The trust will be managed by a board of independent directors. But the charter will strictly mandate that the funds be used exclusively for the legitimate, legal infrastructure projects you've been trying to build. You lose the liquid cash, but you secure the legacy. And more importantly, you completely amputate Vanguard's ability to use that money to destroy you. It's a scorched earth defense. We burn the bridge while we are standing on the other side. Victor fell silent, staring deeply at the intricate diagrams on the glass board. He was a man who had spent his entire life accumulating power, hoarding resources through violence and fear. Relinquishing almost $1 billion was fundamentally contrary to every survival instinct he possessed. Brielle watched him struggle. She understood the magnitude of what she was asking. She walked slowly over to the sofa and sat down on the opposite end, maintaining a respectful distance but offering a quiet, grounding presence. Victor, she said, her voice gentle, stripping away the cold professionalism for a moment. Why are you doing this? Why are you trying to go legitimate? Men in your position usually fight until they are killed or imprisoned. Why walk away? Victor remained silent for a long time, staring out the massive windows into the dark night. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow, stripped of its usual imposing resonance. I had a brother, Victor said quietly, the words feeling heavy and unused. Tomas. He was younger, smarter. He didn't have the stomach for the violence, but he loved the business. He thought we could build something real, something that didn't require blood to sustain. He looked down at his large, scarred hands. 10 years ago, a rival outfit wanted our docks. They couldn't get to me, so they took Tomas. They didn't just kill him, they made an example of him. Victor's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking furiously in his cheek. I slaughtered every single man involved. I burned their operation to ash. I took control of everything. But when the smoke cleared, I realized I had just built a larger, heavier cage. I promised Tomas I would build something clean, something that wouldn't require looking over my shoulder every second of every day. This, he gestured to the mountains of paperwork. This is the only way to keep that promise. Brielle felt a tight ache in her chest. For all his terrifying power and ruthlessness, Victor was driven by the exact same profound grief that fueled her own desperate crusade. They were both ghosts, haunted by the people they had lost, desperately trying to rewrite the brutal rules of the world that had taken them. Then we secure the legacy, Brielle said softly. Her voice filled with absolute conviction. We authorize the irrevocable trust. We cut off Vanguard's attack vectors one by one. And when they finally realize that your empire is impenetrable, they will panic. Victor slowly lifted his head, meeting her gaze. The exhaustion in his eyes was replaced by a cold, burning determination. He nodded slowly. Draft the trust documents, Victor commanded. Burn the bridge. A faint, dangerous smile touched the corners of Brielle's mouth. It's already drafted. I just need your signature. She stood up and retrieved a sleek, black leather folder from her desk, placing it gently on the coffee table in front of him. It was a monumental moment of trust. Victor was surrendering a massive portion of his power based entirely on her legal architecture. He unscrewed his gold fountain pen, the exact same pen he had almost used in the diner, and without hesitation, signed his name, sealing his path toward legitimacy and setting the stage for the final confrontation. The atmosphere in the penthouse shifted violently from defensive fortification to predatory preparation. With the massive, irrevocable trust finalized and Victor's vulnerable assets shielded behind impenetrable walls of legal armor, the time for hiding had officially ended. It was time to build the trap. Brielle and Victor sat opposite each other at the mahogany desk, the city bathed in the harsh, bright light of a Tuesday afternoon. The dynamic between them had evolved into a seamless, highly efficient machine. They anticipated each other's thoughts, blending Victor's ruthless strategic understanding of underworld psychology with Brielle's terrifying mastery of corporate legal warfare. Vanguard won't simply walk away because we blocked their initial takeover attempt, Brielle explained, pacing with restless kinetic energy. They are apex predators. When they hit a wall, they escalate. They will try to force a face-to-face negotiation, believing they can leverage their cartel backing to intimidate you into surrendering the infrastructure they want. Victor leaned back, his eyes dark and calculating. Then we give them the meeting. We invite them into the lion's den. Exactly, Brielle said, stopping and planting her hands on the desk. But we don't just survive the meeting. We use it to completely decapitate their operation. We need to expose their connection to the cartel in a way that is legally undeniable and immediately actionable by federal authorities. We need to hand the FBI a silver platter. Vanguard is too smart to bring a cartel lieutenant to a corporate negotiation, Victor noted skeptically. They'll send their senior partners. Empty suits with clean hands. Which is why we have to force their hand, Brielle replied, a cold, brilliant smile spreading across her face. We have to offer them something so incredibly valuable, so critical to the cartel's immediate survival, that the cartel leadership will demand to be present to guarantee the transfer. Victor raised an eyebrow. And what do we possess that the cartel desperately needs? The Eastern Seaboard shipping routes, Brielle stated flatly. I've analyzed the Vanguard ledger I memorized 3 years ago. The cartel uses a highly specific, decentralized network of your shipping containers to move their product. If we suddenly, legally, and permanently shut down access to those specific docks under the guise of our new legitimate corporate restructuring, their entire distribution network collapses overnight. Victor's eyes widened slightly as he grasped the sheer audacity of the plan. If we shut down those routes, we are effectively declaring open war on the largest cartel on the coast. They won't just send lawyers, they'll send an army. They will try, Brielle corrected smoothly, but they will be desperate. Desperation breeds arrogance, and arrogance breeds catastrophic mistakes. We draft a new contract, an exclusivity agreement. We offer them unrestricted, off-the-books access to the ports. But the contract must be signed in person by the primary guarantor of Vanguard's holding company, and we know the primary guarantor isn't a lawyer. It's the cartel boss, Victor finished, a dark, dangerous grin slowly mirroring hers. We dangle the keys to their kingdom, and we force the devil to come collect them himself. The preparation consumed the next 48 hours. Brielle drafted the most intricate, beautifully deceptive contract of her entire career. On the surface, it was a massive capitulation, surrendering the docks to Vanguard. But buried deep within the complex clauses and subparagraphs was a trigger mechanism. The moment the document was signed, it legally linked the signatory's biometric data and corporate identity directly to a massive, undeniable cache of international money laundering evidence Brielle had hidden on an encrypted federal server 3 years ago. It was a digital guillotine. While Brielle built the legal weapon, Victor prepared the battlefield. He chose a neutral, highly secure location, a massive, glass-walled conference room on the 50th floor of a corporate high-rise currently under construction. It was neutral ground, accessible, but entirely controlled by Victor's men. He called in his most loyal, highly trained security personnel, strategically positioning them to ensure absolute physical dominance of the space without appearing overtly hostile. On the morning of the meeting, the tension in the penthouse was thick enough to choke on. Brielle stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in her suite, adjusting the collar of her sharp, charcoal gray blazer. She looked at her reflection. The terrified waitress was completely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating warrior ready to face the monsters who had stolen her life. Victor knocked softly on her doorframe and stepped into the room. He was wearing a bespoke black suit, looking every inch the terrifying, unstoppable force that commanded the city's shadows. He looked at her, his expression a mixture of profound respect and quiet concern. "Are you ready for this?" Victor asked softly. "Once we step into that room, there is no turning back. You will be face to face with the men who ordered your death." Brielle turned to face him, her eyes calm and clear, reflecting a deep, icy resolve. "I have been running for 3 years, Victor. I am done running. Today, we burn their empire to the ground." Victor nodded slowly, a fierce, protective pride swelling in his chest. He offered her his arm. Then let's go to work. They rode the private elevator down in silence, the quiet hum of the machinery, the only sound, as they descended toward the inevitable confrontation. The trap was set. The bait was laid. All that remained was for the monsters to walk through the door. The unfinished 50th floor was a vast, echoing cavern of exposed concrete steel beams and floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a dizzying, panoramic view of the sprawling city below. In the exact center of the desolate space, an expansive, highly polished boardroom table had been temporarily installed, surrounded by plush leather chairs. It was an island of corporate luxury in a sea of raw, industrial construction. Victor sat at the head of the table, projecting an aura of absolute, terrifying stillness. Behind him, blending perfectly into the shadows of the concrete pillars, stood 4 of his most elite guards, heavily armed and utterly silent. Brielle sat to Victor's immediate right, an open, sleek silver briefcase resting on the table in front of her. Inside the case lay the single, meticulously drafted contract. She kept her eyes focused on the heavy steel elevator doors at the far end of the floor. Her heart was beating with a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She was terrified, but it was a cold, razor-sharp terror that hyper-focused her senses. At exactly 2 p.m., the heavy elevator mechanism ground to a halt. The steel doors slid open with a loud, metallic screech. 5 men stepped out onto the concrete floor. The 3 men in front wore immaculately tailored, obscenely expensive suits. They were the senior partners of Vanguard and Pierce, the arrogant architects of corporate misery. But Brielle's eyes immediately bypassed them, locking onto the 2 men walking slightly behind. One was a massive, heavily scarred enforcer, his eyes scanning the room with dead, reptilian efficiency. The other man was older, dressed in a surprisingly understated tan linen suit. He walked with a slight limp, leaning on a silver-tipped cane, his face weathered and deeply lined. This was Alejandro, the ghost, the absolute head of the cartel, a man who technically did not exist on any federal database, the man who had ordered Brielle's execution 3 years ago. They approached the table. The Vanguard partners moved to sit, projecting practiced, arrogant confidence. Alejandro remained standing, his dark, hollow eyes fixing instantly on Victor. He barely registered Brielle's presence, dismissing her as a simple administrative assistant. "Victor," Alejandro said, his voice a raspy, papery whisper that somehow carried across the massive room. "You have caused my associates a great deal of unnecessary frustration. You refused a very generous, very clean exit strategy." "The strategy was flawed," Victor replied, his voice a low, rumbling earthquake. "It required me to surrender my autonomy." "I don't surrender, Alejandro. I negotiate." One of the Vanguard partners, a slick-haired man named Sterling, scoffed loudly. "You are in no position to negotiate, Victor. Your legal infrastructure is antiquated. We can tie your operations up in federal court for a decade. We are offering you a grace period. Sign the Port Authority over to us, and we let you keep your local rackets." Victor did not look at Sterling. He kept his gaze locked entirely on Alejandro. "I am offering you exclusive, completely unrestricted access to my entire Eastern Seaboard shipping network. No oversight, no union interference. A completely clear pipeline for your specialty imports. But the contract requires a primary guarantor, someone with the actual authority to ensure my compensation isn't interfered with by empty suits." He gestured dismissively toward the lawyers. Alejandro's eyes narrowed slightly, calculating the immense value of the offer against the potential risk. He stepped forward, leaning heavily on his cane, and looked down at the silver briefcase in front of Brielle. "Let me see the document," Alejandro commanded. Brielle slowly turned the briefcase around, sliding the thick, crisp document across the polished wood toward the cartel boss. She kept her head slightly bowed, utilizing the shadows to obscure her features. Alejandro didn't bother reading the dense legalese. He handed it to Sterling. The lawyer pulled a gold pen from his pocket and began rapidly scanning the pages, his eyes darting back and forth, for 3 agonizing minutes. The only sound in the cavernous room was the wind howling against the massive glass windows and the frantic rustling of heavy paper. "The clauses are tight," Sterling finally announced, looking up at Alejandro with a greedy, triumphant smirk. "It's a complete capitulation. He's transferring the master leases and the union oversight directly to our shell corporation. It's exactly what we wanted." Alejandro looked at Victor, a faint, condescending smile touching his thin lips. "You are learning how the modern world works, Victor. Violence is messy. Paper is permanent." Alejandro reached out and took the gold pen from Sterling. He leaned over the table, placing the pen against the signature line at the bottom of the final page. Brielle's breath caught in her throat. The moment of absolute destruction was mere milliseconds away. "Before you sign," Brielle said. Her voice cut through the silence like a gunshot, ringing loud, clear, and dripping with authority. Alejandro paused, his pen hovering above the paper. He finally looked at her. Truly looked at her. His eyes widened slightly as recognition, slow and terrifying, began to dawn in the depths of his cold gaze. Sterling and the other lawyers stared at her in utter shock. Brielle stood up slowly, pushing her chair back. She looked directly into the eyes of the man who had destroyed her life. "You might want to review the addendum buried in subsection 9, paragraph C," Brielle said, her voice echoing powerfully off the concrete walls. "It's a specialized linkage clause. The moment your biometric signature touches that document, it automatically triggers a massive, pre-programmed data dump to the FBI, the DEA, and Interpol. It links this exact holding company directly to the Vanguard ledger from 3 years ago. The ledger you burned my life to the ground to hide." Sterling turned an ashen, horrific shade of gray. He violently snatched the contract from the table, his eyes tearing through subsection 9. He dropped the paper as if it had suddenly caught fire. "Oh my God. It's a closed-loop federal confession. It bypasses our entire firewall." Alejandro slowly straightened up, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He looked from Brielle to Victor, realizing exactly how thoroughly he had been outmaneuvered. He had walked directly into a fatal, inescapable trap. "Kill them," Alejandro hissed, stepping back. His enforcer reached for his weapon, but he didn't even clear his holster. In perfect, terrifying synchronization, Victor's 4 guards stepped from the shadows, the distinct, heavy clack of assault rifles being chambered echoing through the room. 4 laser sights appeared instantly on the chests of Alejandro and his men. Victor stood up slowly, towering over the table. "You are right, Alejandro," Victor rumbled, his voice filled with absolute, terrifying finality. "Violence is messy. Paper is permanent. The federal agents are currently waiting in the lobby downstairs. You are going to sign that confession, or you are not going to leave this floor." The trap was sprung. The monsters were caged. And Brielle, standing tall and unbroken beside the most dangerous man in the city, had finally won. The aftermath of the 50th floor boardroom confrontation was swift, brutal, and entirely legal. Alejandro, cornered with absolute certainty and staring down the barrels of 4 assault rifles, had signed the document. The moment his pen left the paper, Brielle had tapped a single key on her encrypted laptop, transmitting the massive, damning cache of Vanguard's money laundering ledgers directly to the highest levels of federal law enforcement. Within 48 hours, the city was unrecognizable. The FBI raided the gleaming Vanguard and Pierce offices, completely dismantling the corrupt law firm and arresting the senior partners in a highly publicized sweep. Alejandro and his top lieutenants were placed under federal indictment with absolutely no possibility of bail, the irrefutable paper trail Brielle had orchestrated sealing their fates forever. Victor's empire, however, remained completely untouched. Shielded by the massive, impenetrable blind trusts and the incredibly complex legal fortifications Brielle had built, his legitimate holdings thrived while the criminal elements of his organization were quietly, systematically dissolved. He had kept his promise to his brother. He had finally stepped out of the shadows. It was late Friday evening. The penthouse office was quiet, bathed in the soft, warm glow of a single desk lamp. The massive mountains of files and chaotic flowcharts that had dominated the room for weeks were gone, replaced by clean, organized surfaces. Victor stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city. The storm that had raged for weeks seemed to have finally broken, leaving behind a clear, crisp night sky filled with stars. He held a glass of expensive bourbon, the ice clinking softly against the crystal. The heavy oak doors opened, and Brielle walked in. She was no longer wearing the severe, armor-like suits of the war room. She wore a simple, elegant dark dress, her hair falling softly around her shoulders. The crushing, suffocating weight that had haunted her eyes for 3 agonizing years was entirely gone, replaced by a profound, peaceful clarity. Victor turned as she entered. a rare, genuine smile softening the hard lines of his face. "The final transfer is complete," Brielle said, walking over to the mahogany desk and placing a single thin folder on the polished wood. "The shipping routes are officially under the control of the independent board. The transition is totally seamless. You are, for all legal intents and purposes, a completely legitimate, incredibly wealthy real estate developer." Victor walked over to the desk, looking down at the thin folder. It represented the culmination of his entire life's struggle. He looked up at Brielle, the profound depth of his gratitude evident in his dark eyes. "We did it," Victor said quietly. "You tore down the most powerful corrupt firm in the state, and you built me a fortress. I owe you my life, Brielle. My life and my freedom." Brielle smiled, a gentle, knowing expression. She walked over to the window, standing beside him, looking out at the glittering expanse of the city they had fundamentally altered. "You don't owe me anything, Victor," Brielle said softly. "We saved each other. I gave you the legal architecture to escape your cage, and you gave me the power and the protection to finally stop running." They stood in comfortable silence for a long moment, watching the headlights of the cars moving like slow rivers of light through the concrete canyons far below. "So," Victor said, turning to look at her, his tone shifting to something more careful, more vulnerable. "What happens now? Vanguard is gone. The cartel is crippled. You are completely free. You can go anywhere, be anyone. You could reclaim your license, join any legitimate firm in the country. They would kill to have you." Brielle looked down at the city. She thought about the high-rise law firms, the endless corporate ladder, the sterile, ruthless ambition that had almost cost her everything. She thought about the terrified girl trembling in the diner, and she thought about the woman who had stood in the boardroom and stared down the devil. She turned slowly to face Victor. He was a dangerous man, a man forged in violence, but he was also a man who possessed a profound sense of loyalty, honor, and an unyielding commitment to his word. In the chaotic, treacherous world she had been forced to navigate, he was the only truly solid ground she had ever found. "I don't want to go back to that world," Brielle said, her voice steady and clear. "I don't want to build traps for anonymous corporations anymore." She reached out and gently touched the polished mahogany of the desk. "You have a massive, legitimate real estate empire now. You are going to need a general counsel. Someone who knows exactly how the monsters think. Someone who can see the traps before they are ever set." Victor's eyes widened slightly, the hope he had carefully suppressed suddenly flaring to life. "Are you saying you want to stay?" "I'm saying," Brielle replied, a genuine, radiant smile finally breaking across her face, "that we make a terrifyingly effective team, and I think our work here is just beginning." Victor looked at her, the heavy, dark shadows of his past finally receding, replaced by the brilliant, undeniable light of a completely new future. He slowly set his bourbon glass down on the desk. He extended his hand, not as a desperate plea for survival, but as a genuine offer of equal partnership. "Then let's get to work," Victor said. Brielle took his hand, the grip firm and deeply reassuring. The war was over. The ghosts were finally laid to rest. Out of the ashes of betrayal and violence, they had forged something unbreakable. True power isn't found in a loaded gun or an intimidating reputation. It's found in the courage to face your darkest fears and the wisdom to use your greatest vulnerabilities as your strongest weapons. Brielle and Victor, two souls hunted by their pasts, proved that when raw strength is guided by brilliant strategy, even the most impossible traps can be dismantled. Sometimes, the only way to escape the darkness is to drag the monsters out into the light. If this story of redemption, legal warfare, and unexpected alliances kept you on the edge of your seat, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps bring more thrilling, cinematic stories to life. Let me know in the comments what your favorite moment was.